This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live on Bloomberg TV, radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Carol Massar. Tim, my co-host, Tim Stenivek, he is on assignment. You'll hear more about that tomorrow. But with us is Bloomberg TV Markets Correspondent Norah Mulinda. And Norah, we're looking on this Monday, March 9th, 2026. We're just a couple hours away from the closing bell. We're definitely off our worst levels when it comes to the equity trade.
Absolutely. And keeping an eye on the SPX, we do see it's lower by about 0.6%. But people really thinking about what oil is looking like in this environment and the impact it could have on inflation long-term potentially, and Fed rate cuts.
Well, on that, we are seeing also WTI crude. It was as high as just shy of 120 a barrel. Right now, we're at about just below 95 a barrel. So we have pulled off some of our highs. We're going to get into all of that. This, as President Trump is talking to a lot of members of the press, including the New York Post, that he has a plan for everything when it comes to oil prices. So we're going to dig into that. So coming up this hour, though, something we talked about on Friday, and that is the concerns, maybe the reality of stagflation, lower growth. We saw that in the jobs print, concerns about inflation. So we're going to talk about that, especially with higher oil prices. We're also going to get into the political price, perhaps, of the war as factions arise among the MAGA faithful. It's so interesting with midterms, affordability, a main issue when it comes to U.S. politics. Here we are at war with a president that calls himself the peace president.
Right. And so really striking that balance, especially being that we are in a midterm year, I always keep my eyes on the real estate space. Yeah. And that has certainly been a topic of affordability. If you just flash back to the State of the Union address, people were a little bit disappointed with President Donald Trump's lack of speaking too much about his plans for housing affordability in the United States.
Yeah, specific plans always help. We're also going to get into another headline involving the media story that has gripped us for months now. It's a done deal. Paramount, Skydance, is buying Warner Brothers. But we're going to get into a headline that came out about kind of a silent investor, a passive investor. We'll talk about that. And the new media space as well. We'll do that with longtime watcher Laura Martin. First up, though, let's get you going on this Monday with a check on the trading day. Here is Charlie.
All right, thank you very much. And we are looking at a down day for the equity market. Do want to begin with what is happening with crude oil. Right now, looking at WTI just above $94 a barrel. It is up by 3.5% as we woke up and as we came to work this morning. WTI trading above $100. Also seeing Brent crude off session highs, up 6.2% right now. 98.62 for a barrel of Brent, but it too trading below $100. Bears repeating. Barrel of WTI West Texas Intermediate crude 94.18 right now. It is up by 3.6%. But the war in the Middle East sparking a fresh bout of volatility with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all very much in the red right now. Looking at a 0.5% drop on the S&P at 6705, down 35 points. The Dow down 435, down 0.9. NASDAQ did turn higher briefly earlier in the session, but right now down 39 points. That is a drop of 0.2%. The VIX, Wall Street's fear gauge, holding just below 28. The 10-year 4.12%. Gold is down 1.5%, 5,095 the ounce, and crude bears repeating 93 handle right now, 93.98 on West Texas Intermediate crude. It is holding on to a gain of 3.3%. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi has announced the indictment of the two alleged ISIS-inspired terrorists who attempted to bomb a protest in New York City over the weekend. Recapping stocks lower, S&P down 0.5%, West Texas Intermediate crude now at 93.80, a barrel up 3.1%. And for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pellet. Carol and Norah, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, much appreciated, Charlie Pellet. I'm Carol Massar along with Norah Mulinda. Norah in for Tim on this Monday. So let's get to it, because just a quick check on our top live blog when it comes to the U.S. war in Iran. We are constantly checking on all of the new headlines. We've got the G7 vowing to tap oil reserves if needed. NATO intercepting a ballistic missile that entered Turkish airspace. President Trump signaling a widening war Iran, indicating it won't back down. Some of that happened kind of late Friday and in through the weekend. And then something we also talked about on Friday, and that is stagflation trades sweeping through markets on investor unease, although we are off our worst levels of the session. We do want to get into, though, what's going on with crude and think about that in terms of economic and market implications. We did see WTI crude nearly hitting 120 a barrel today. President Trump addressed higher oil prices specifically on Saturday in an exchange with Bloomberg News senior White House correspondent Josh Wingrove.
What about the Strait of Hormuz? There's no traffic really going through it.
Well, that's, the ship's choices, but we have it cleaned out. We've wiped out their Navy. Their Navy is now at the bottom of the sea. So that's the choice. This is an excursion. We figured oil prices would go up, which they will. They'll also come down. They'll come down very fast, and we will have gotten rid of a major cancer on the face of the earth.
Again, that was President Trump over the weekend on Saturday. And yes, indeed, markets do go up, markets go down. It's just the duration of those cycles that we're all trying to figure out. I also do want to point out President Trump on social, writing this on Sunday, he said short-term oil prices, which will drop rapidly when the destruction of the Iran nuclear threat is over, is a very small price to pay for the United States of America and world safety and peace. Only fools would think differently. Again, this is coming from the president writing out on social on Sunday. Continuing to tie together the social posts, the war, the economic consequences, and so much more is Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst Jennifer Welch. She joins us from the Bloomberg DC Bureau. She's been a go-to for us. Jenny, good to have you here with Nora and myself on Monday. I want to just take a step back and I'm curious about the conversations you guys have been having through the weekend today, another new week, second week of this U.S. war in Iran. Is there any consensus around the timeline of what the president and his team are thinking about how long this war lasts?
No, and even the administration has given conflicting ideas on how long they think this would last. If we recall, President Trump was saying last week that they originally planned for this to be 4 to 5 weeks, but now they've accomplished some of their goals a little bit sooner, so it may be shorter, but at the same time, he's willing to stay in the fight for as long as it takes, while his Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, is saying this won't be a forever war. But I think a couple of signs over the weekend point to the fact that this isn't likely to wrap up anytime soon. In addition to President Trump's comments about seeking an unconditional surrender, something that Iran does not seem interested in, and suggesting the U.S. is going to escalate on its side, we also have Iran choosing a new supreme leader who, for his part, also doesn't seem to be in a rush for diplomacy or negotiations. So I think we see both sides digging in their heels here, preparing to fight this out, and Iran in particular realizing that its strategy of imposing costs on the region and on global oil markets may be starting to pay off.
What do we know about the leader that was chosen and where President Trump feels about this? As you said, he has said he wants to kind of basically sign off on this. It is the son of Ayatollah Khamenei, and my understanding is that maybe even more conservative than his father was. But what do we know, and what are we kind of trying to figure out, read the tea leaves about any kind of conversations, perhaps backroom conversations that perhaps U.S. and Iran might be having?
Yeah, so the new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, he's the son of the late Supreme Leader, was widely expected to be the successor to him. He is conservative, like his father, shares many of his ideological leanings, including in really believing in the core tenets of the Islamic Republic. So by no means a reformer or a change agent. This is his first public role, though, so there's a lot that we don't know about his leanings. He could prove to be more pragmatic, but at the same time, he is facing sanctions by the United States, has lost many close family members in this war already, including his father and his wife, and he's probably not in a rush to talks. I think the perspective in Tehran from members of the Islamic Republic is that they are in a war of resistance right now with the United States, and it's somewhat of an asymmetric one where they're willing to bear a lot of costs and suffer a lot of pain, and their goal is to try and make the United States and its partners blink first. And I think what all of that points to is that we won't be seeing Iran moving forward towards a surrender or the sort of decapitation arrangement that the Trump administration arranged with Venezuela, which may be what Washington had been pinning its hopes on.
So when we think about this new leadership, what aspects in particular do you think are most crucial as we think about this transition period between there as well as just geopolitically speaking, the relations between countries here?
I think the important thing to keep in mind, and what the selection of a new supreme leader demonstrates, is even though U.S. and Israeli strikes took out a significant number of senior Iranian officials, including the former supreme leader, the system is surviving and it's finding new ways and new people to put in charge. And I think what that suggests is a level of resilience that makes a campaign to force Iran's total surrender, or whatever goals the Trump administration currently has in mind, very difficult, and the sort of campaign that might last longer than what the administration had originally envisioned. They were hoping that Iran would fold rather quickly after these massive strikes. That doesn't seem to be the case. And I think also when you look at the military perspective, it's sort of a similar story. Iran is continuing to carry out strikes on Gulf countries to hold shipping in the Strait of Hormuz at risk, and all of that is part of the reason why we haven't seen traffic resume, despite what President Trump talked about in that clip with offering naval escorts and protection, that ships don't seem to be taking him up on that offer.
I keep thinking too, Jenny, about all of this against the region, because it's not just Iran and the U.S., Iran and Israel. We are feeling strikes throughout the region. And I saw in our reporting, Saudi Arabia hardening its tone against Iran as it dealt with incoming projectiles again today, including ones heading toward oil giant Aramco's Sheba field and areas in and around Riyadh. This new leader, any consensus, as you said, he hasn't been very public. This is his first public role. But is there any consensus that we're hearing from the region about what this leader might mean for Iran going forward? And as you remind us, the regime is never one person. It's many people.
It's many people, but this particular person in particular seems to be more in line with his father's perspective on fighting the full fight, right? And using proxies and partners to continue this war of resistance against the United States, whether it's a hot war like what we're seeing today, or more the sort of long battle by proxy that had been the preceding decades kind of conflict. I think what this means for partners in the region is they're facing increasingly tough choices as their air defenses start to run out, come under strain by the just volume of Iranian projectiles that they're dealing with. They're going to start to need to make choices about where they dedicate those air defenses. I think also this is forcing a bit of reluctance or frustration with the United States that the U.S. began this conflict despite them lobbying Washington not to proceed with it, and despite it putting them at the front lines of this battle that they didn't want to participate in, and they actually have not been, for most of them, really active participants in to date, yet that didn't seem to spare them from taking a lot of the incoming from Iran.
So could his appointment at all increase the likelihood of deeper economic retaliation against Gulf states or Western interests for that matter? And if so, what would be the knock-on effects for regional trade flows?
I actually think the longer pole in the tent for that will be the stockpiles that Iran still has left at its disposal, how many missiles it has left, how many drones it has left. The United States and Israel have really focused their attacks on decimating those capabilities, and in particular on the missile side, destroying Iran's missile production facilities, its missile launchers. We don't know how many missiles it still has in its stockpiles, but if it can't launch them, then that is a real cap on its ability to hold those assets and shipping in the region at risk. But I think the intent will remain there because this is a strategy that Iran thinks is working, that it can essentially force other partners in the region who don't want to incur these costs to blink and to put Washington under pressure to bring the war to an end. They're also probably betting that the more that gas prices rise in the United States, that will also exert pressure on President Trump. So I think it's less about intent and more about capability. And that right now is a real big open question. But I would stagger to guess that at least their drone stockpile is significant enough for this to be a problem for at least the next few weeks.
I also do wonder, and I want to shift to your many hats that you wear, but the economic impact globally and certainly on the U.S. We just had a headline from The Information crossing that Meta platforms closing its Tel Aviv office temporarily, that coming from The Information. We had last week a story about drone strikes damaging 3 facilities operated by Amazon.com in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. So I do think about this region that has really many areas have transformed themselves and embraced, I don't want to say capitalism, but to some extent, yes, in terms of building up their financial presence as trying to attract in more investors. Is it too soon to say that there will be some kind of economic impact on that region?
I think it is a little too soon to say that there'll be a long-term impact, but I think certainly the perspective from a lot of Gulf countries that, as you mentioned, have made a bet on transforming themselves into sort of pillars of stability in an otherwise somewhat tumultuous region is having all of this incoming, having these this conflict, having to deal with strikes on civilian facilities. All of that really undercuts this image that they have worked so long to build up. We're seeing a number of multinationals talk about ceasing operations or having to shift to different footing as a result of the conflict. And I think it's going to take time for them to not just rebuild those air defense stockpiles, but to rebuild that image that this conflict has really hit hard.
Beyond just gasoline in the United States, what sectors do you think also may feel the brunt of higher energy costs? I know you mentioned the fact that potentially Iran is betting on the fact that President Donald Trump will actually take a step back, given the fact that there are a lot of concerns from U.S. consumers about elevated gas prices.
That's really the wicked problem when it comes to higher oil prices, is they tend to affect everything that gets transported using gasoline and oil. So it's highly inflationary, and I think that's going to be the real challenge facing the United States. Even though we're a net energy producer now, and that will cushion the economic impact to a certain degree, it won't necessarily help folks when it comes to what the cost is at the pump and what the cost is at the grocery store. And the impact on inflation will really depend on how long this conflict lasts and how high oil prices go. And those are interrelated. The more markets think that these disruptions won't be temporary, likely the higher oil prices are to go. We saw them touch very high levels overnight in Asia trading. They're likely to continue to grow if we think, for example, the Strait of Hormuz won't be opening anytime soon. That could put prices well above 110. We estimate even higher than that if there's a presupposition in the markets that the strait is going to remain closed for as long as 2 to 3 months. We could see prices rise much higher, and the impact on inflation could be quite significant.
Which brings us to something we started talking about on Friday, Jenny, and that is just to kind of wrap up here, this concern about stagflation coming off of a weak jobs report, concerns about growth slowing, yet those inflationary concerns were out there even before this U.S. war in Iran, and this just exacerbates the situation. When do we make a call on stagflation? And, once that train has kind of left the station, like how quickly does it happen?
That's going to be, I think, a central challenge for not just the Fed, but a lot of central banks is how much can they look through the impact of higher oil prices on inflation? Do they think it's going to be temporary, or are they going to be facing this dual challenge of dealing with higher inflation, but also lower growth expectations as a result of these energy prices? And in many places, real direct energy disruptions because they simply aren't able to access anything. Yeah. I think the next few days will be telling in terms of how long these disruptions might last.
It's the million, billion, trillion dollar question, right? How long does this last? And that really then can make us figure out the equation as to what will ultimately be the impact. You put it all in place, though, as we need to do as we go from day to day. Jenny, thank you so much. Jenny Welch, she's Bloomberg Economics, Chief Geoeconomics Analyst there in our D.C. Bureau. As we head to a break, we just want to pull your attention to something that is going on here in New York City. New York City Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch, they are holding a press conference. This, of course, has to do with the explosives, the improvised explosives thrown near New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani's residence over the weekend. Authorities continue to investigate this situation and potential terrorism links to those two suspects that are in custody. So we will continue to monitor and bring you any headlines as known. All right, we are going to stay over the conflict, the war in the Middle East, as the U.S. war with Iran marks its second week. It is creating some factions among the MAGA faithful. So we're going to get into this story. It's a Bloomberg Big Take. We've got the details. And as we head to a break, just a reminder, we're definitely off our worst levels of the session on this Monday. We are still down, though, about 0.4% on the S&P 500, NASDAQ 100. Call it almost flat, a little bit lower, down about 21 points. More when we continue. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are keeping an eye on those fast-moving energy markets. And right now, West Texas Intermediate crude is trading below $93 a barrel. Yes, higher, but up 2.2% right now. Keep in mind that in the early going, we had West Texas Intermediate crude trading above $100 a barrel. So right now, stocks, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. Stocks, however, paring losses as a surge in energy prices fades after oil topped 100. The S&P down 27 now, drop there of 0.4%. Dow Industrials down 360. That is a decline of 0.8%. NASDAQ briefly was higher earlier today. We've got the NASDAQ Composite Index now lower by 0.1%. The NASDAQ 100 Index also down 0.1%. The VIX, Wall Street's fear gauge, at 27. The 10-year currently yielding 4.12%. Gold is down 1.3%. Spot gold 51.02 the ounce. And again, bears repeating, West Texas Intermediate crude, yes, higher by 3%, but it is currently trading at $93.64 a barrel. Uber says a feature designed to match female riders and drivers will be available nationwide, expanding access to a safety measure as it seeks to resolve thousands of sexual assault complaints from passengers in the United States. And federal prosecutors have charged two men, Amir Balat and Ibrahim Kayumi, for allegedly bringing improvised explosive devices to a protest outside the mayor's residence in New York. NYPD Commissioner Jessica Tisch says the devices, which did not detonate, could have caused serious injury or death. She is holding a press briefing right now. Recapping, S&P down 26, drop there of 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar along with Norah Mulinda in for Tim on this Monday. So we've got the midterms coming in November. We know that. And some are wondering a lot about the political cost of President Trump's war in Iran. The president has been emphatic about his intentions in the widening Middle East war. He said just on Friday he'd accept no deal with Iran other than unconditional surrender and pledged the U.S. will work tirelessly to restore the country's economy if a new leader is installed whom he deems acceptable. That was Friday. We know Iran now has a new leader, as we just talked about with our own Jenny Welch in the last segment. So let's get to more on how some Make America Great Again influencers and GOP politicians are expressing backlash against President Trump's policies. It's a recent Bloomberg Big Take. It's something we were talking about all over the weekend. With us is Bloomberg News senior national political correspondent Nancy Cook. She is in the Bloomberg News Washington, D.C. bureau. Nancy, great to have you here with us. Great story. Tell us about this chorus of betrayal, who they are and what they are up to.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Really what has been happening as Trump has bombed Iran along with Israel is that there are a bunch of MAGA influencers who have huge names and huge megaphones, including Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, the former lawmaker Marjorie Taylor Greene, who do not agree with this military incursion and have been really vocal on it. They've just been saying that this violates Trump's longtime campaign promise of America First by not sort of getting involved in the Middle East, and that this is really not part of the agenda that they're looking for.
Well, Nancy, were some of these factions anticipated? Were we expecting to see some sort of breaking up within the group more broadly? What are you hearing from your sources?
Well, this is certainly to be expected. I mean, Trump, since 2015, when I've covered his first presidential campaign, has really promised that he wouldn't get the U.S. involved in these Middle East conflicts. He was very critical of past presidents' involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when he got involved in Iran before with bombings, and also when he got involved in taking out the leader of Venezuela, some of these MAGA factions also made noise then. I would say that given the fact that there doesn't seem to be a ton of strategy behind this decision in Iran, or it shifts every day, and then also the unclear timeline for how long the U.S. will be involved there, really has incited this wing of the MAGA base just to say this really isn't what we signed up for. And I just want to point out it's not just the MAGA wing that the White House is worried about. It's also independent voters who aren't necessarily Republican, but who backed Trump in 2024. Voters overwhelmingly disapprove of Iran, and a key part of the midterms will be getting these independent swing voters like young men, black men, and Hispanics to keep supporting Republicans in 2026.
I got to say, Nancy, I keep shaking my head thinking, wait a minute, we've already determined affordability is such an important issue, right? We know from past elections, it's the economy, stupid. Like, we get this. This is a playbook that is in many ways tried and true. And I'm just trying to understand, who is calling the shots on this war? Is this really what President Trump wants? And it makes me wonder, is there some crazy strategy that we're not paying attention to that gives him the confidence to do this? I know the midterms are 8 months or so out? Maybe I'm not counting right. Maybe it's 6 months, 8 months. But I'm just wondering, is there some strategy that they're like, don't worry about it. We're going to challenge the elections, the midterm result. I'm just trying to understand this, how this fits in.
So from my sources who I speak to, Trump really, he's a lame duck president. He's not running for president again, or at least that's what we think so far. And he really views this opportunity in the Middle East to shape foreign policy. And so what he is doing is he is ignoring his advisors' pleas to keep focusing on affordability. And he sees these huge opportunities to reshape the global order. We saw that with NATO and sort of how he's pressured those countries to up their military spending. We've seen it with Venezuela. We've seen it with Iran. His administration is eyeing leadership changes in Cuba. And so he is looking at his legacy, and he has decided that he wants foreign policy and reshaping that world order to be part of that legacy. And he is kind of ignoring advisors and all the outside pollsters who say the midterms are going to be about the economy. We know that's the case. And he's thinking much more broadly about how he wants to be remembered.
Well, what about Republican strategists? What are they saying during this time period about the potential political payoff? Because if it seems as though, he's not necessarily listening to advisors, what do they think about the potential impact as we walk step by step closer to the midterm elections?
Maybe it makes him look, Nancy, very presidential in some ways, right?
Maybe. I think it just introduces a huge unknown into the midterms. And I think that Republican strategists are worried that if the conflict goes on for a long time, that this will overshadow the midterms. The other political risk is, of course, rising energy prices, which we've already seen happen this week. Gas prices has been a real bright spot in his economic agenda, whereas tariffs and other things have been more nuanced and complicated things. And if the energy prices continue to rise, then that could be a real political problem for the president in November. You have to remember, gas prices and grocery prices are usually what voters think of when they think about, is my life affordable? Am I feeling comfortable?
It's interesting, though, for somebody who, I think you've already referred to this, he thinks of himself as the peace president. He's been, critical of past presidents, George W. in particular, right, in terms of their decision to launch the Iraqi war. So it's interesting to see him do this.
Yeah, I think it just shows that he has never had, he does have some fixed ideas about tariffs, for instance, and he has some fixed ideas about immigration. But I do think that his sort of political instincts are fairly malleable, and we've seen that over his decades as a politician. And it is quite interesting that he has decided to really become this foreign policy president in a way that I couldn't have even anticipated when I covered his 2024 campaign. It's been a surprise to me the extent to which he has involved the U.S. in these different countries and sort of who's going to be running them, and just involving the U.S. military.
Well, I want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of swing state voters. How do you think about the potential impacts? What are you hearing from your sources about the impacts of gas prices, given the fact that the economy in its state is something that everyone experiences no matter what type of political affiliation you have? So thinking about this K-shaped economy that we're dealing with, plus the gas prices, how do you hear from your sources that they're thinking about the impacts for some of those swing state voters?
Well, I think Republicans are quite worried. A lot of Republicans that I speak to privately think that they will lose the House of Representatives. They think that Republicans will hold on to the Senate, but narrowly. And, a big part of that is because Trump keeps straying from this affordability message. Americans still feel like grocery prices are still high. If the energy prices keep going up, that's a problem. Housing continues to be a persistent problem. We've seen the jobs numbers really aren't coming in at great numbers. Plus, people are, companies are starting to shed a lot of jobs. It's hard for people to get hired. So the economic picture is just really nuanced and not as great as many voters thought it would be. You have to remember Trump returned to power by criticizing Joe Biden relentlessly for inflation and his handling of the economy. And now Trump himself, is experiencing the same economic problems that really undid the Democrats.
All right. So it's just interesting to see this go on. And I go back to, I always think about, Nancy, with this White House, and this is because everyone kind of seems to say to us, there's a lot always going on, and you wonder what you are looking at versus what you should be looking at. And I do once again go to the November elections, whether or not, I was just looking at, don't judge me, but on Polymarket in terms of mail-ins and whether or not President Trump is going to, not allow those. And I think 30% of voters cast in the 2024 presidential election were mail-in ballots. So we know that this is important. So I just wonder what might be going on behind the scenes, not to be like a, conspiracy person or anything. Hey, one of the things I want to ask you is, where is Congress with all of this stuff going on? Why are they not in Washington?
Well, Congress, they always take big breaks. Part of the government is shut down, or at least DHS is. And, Congress, you also have to remember, the Republicans on the Hill, they control both the House and the Senate, have really acquiesced to Trump on everything. I do think that, if they lose the midterms, then we may see more Republicans standing up to Trump. But, Republicans have not been a huge guardrail against this president. He did not ask Congress about the bombing of Iran ahead of time. He did not get Congress to authorize this. And so, he sort of left them out of the decision-making process. And that's really their own doing. They haven't stood up for themselves to make sure that they are a check on the White House.
So if Congress does actually feel sidelined in this moment, what tools does it actually have, if you will, to rein in the administration?
Well, Congress took a vote last week, which Representative Thomas Massie put forward to try to pull back some of Trump's power in Iran. It failed in the House. And so, there is democracy working. It's just not, the Republicans are sort of loath to put that check on. I think what will happen is that if Republicans do lose the House and Democrats take over, what we will see is a huge raft of investigations into how Trump handled Iran, into how his family is profiting off of the White House. I think a ton of cabinet officials will be hauled up to the Congress to testify. And so I think that, Trump is well aware that if Republicans lose the House, there will be a lot of investigations. He could be impeached again, for instance. However, I still think that he's very focused on this idea of nation building and legacy in a way that a lot of us didn't foresee during the last presidential campaign.
Yeah, totally. I think it caught us all off guard, especially when you think of how the 2026 began with Venezuela. Nancy, thank you so much. Bloomberg News Senior National Political Correspondent Nancy Cook. Be sure to check out. It was a big take. You can find that story on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com. All right, we'll have more on the Trump White House, by the way. We'll do that in the 4 o'clock hour. We're going to have Brown University's Wendy Schiller, so we'll kind of dig a little bit more deeper into that. When we come back, a Chinese investor stepping up and investing in the new hookup between Paramount and Warner Brothers Discovery, the story that keeps on giving.
Continues. Never ending.
Laura Martin will be with us.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got NASDAQ in the green, trading higher now. Little changed, up under 0.1%, but looking at an 18-point gain on the NASDAQ Composite Index. The NASDAQ 100 Index also higher, little changed, up under 0.1%. The S&P 500 Index has managed to trim most of a 1.5% drop, down 19 points now, down 0.3%. It is set for the lowest since November. Higher oil costs prompting investors to price in faster inflation as well as risks to growth. The Dow down 340, down 0.7%, but keeping it all in context, S&P down by 0.3%. The VIX under 27 now with a 10-year 4.13%. Spot gold is down 1.1%, 51.16 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude 95.16 a barrel, up by 4.6%. We began the day with WTI above $100 a barrel. Bitcoin up 2% now at 68,548. Oil stocks are higher along with the price of crude. ExxonMobil up 0.6%. Chevron is up 0.4%. ConocoPhillips up by about 0.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pellet. and Carol and Nora. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Charlie Pellet there with a Bloomberg Business News Flash. Carol Massar along with Norah Mulinda in for Tim for the next couple of days. Tim's on assignment. In the meantime, I was kind of wondering when we were going to come back to this story, and we're talking about the next Fed chair and our Bloomberg government team. Zach Cohen just putting out a story. Kevin Warsh will meet with senators this week as he seeks their approval to become chairman of the Fed. This is according to 3 people familiar with his plan. Now, the customary meetings with senators before his expected hearing mark the next stage in Warsh's quest to replace Jerome Powell as the head of the National Monetary System. So I was wondering about it. Like, there was a point where that's all we talked about, I feel like, with our market guests.
And it says that one of the senators on Warsh's schedule is Senator Tom Tillis. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. We do know that Trump formally nominated Warsh just last week in hopes of replacing Powell. So we'll have to see how this progresses.
Well, and what's interesting about Senator Tillis is he has warned that the probe amounts to inappropriate pressure on Powell to lower interest rates. And that is, of course, the probe, the investigation into the Fed's $2.5 billion renovation of its headquarters. And Tillis has been pretty critical, very critical of this and other concerns when it comes to the Federal Reserve. So that'll be something to keep a watch on. Meantime, a story that has captured us for many months. We're talking about Paramount Skydance, the battle for Warner Brothers Discovery, also Netflix, of course, involved. Paramount Skydance winning that bid. Tencent Holdings, though, meantime, a story out today, intends to invest several $100 million in that Paramount acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery, according to people familiar with the situation. Chinese company would be acting as a passive financial investors, according to those in the know. We wanted to get Laura Martin's thoughts. She is someone who has watched this unfold. She knows the media space, the old and the new media, as it continues to evolve. She is senior entertainment and internet analyst at Needham & Company, and she joins us from Los Angeles. Laura, so great to have you back with us. Hope you are well. The deal, it's finally done. I feel like we've been talking to you since Bloomberg Screen Time last fall when Netflix was like, nope, not interested. It has gone to Paramount Skydance. Is this good? How do you kind of finally see it? It went for a higher price. There's a lot of debt. So do you think this is a good thing for Paramount Skydance? Let's start there.
Yes, I do. I think it's their vision is very interested and very differentiated. They really are going to use the Oracle Cloud, which of course is the father that's really funding this acquisition, very closely. There's a very close technology tie-in. And I really are sort of thinking like broader about how Hollywood transitions into the AI future, which I think is going to be good for, I think this combined entity, they're saying they can close it in the third quarter of this year. So that would be by September 30th would be like record speed. But if they can, I think they would become a leader in Hollywood as opposed to two sort of, subscale competitors.
I mean, how important was this for them? We know that Netflix is the name that everybody knows. It's the world's largest paid streaming service. So just how critical was this in terms of Paramount Skydance's portfolio?
I think it was life and death for P-Sky because it was just too subscale and it was going to be irrelevant. And the competitors to Hollywood these days are really Google, which owns YouTube, and Amazon, which owns Prime Video. And those are the real competitors to Netflix, for example, and Disney. And P-Sky, without buying Warner Brothers, would have been just like a pond to be stepped on. So now with Warner Brothers, it's sort of the same size as Disney together, just with a lot more debt. So they have to solve the debt problem and generate free cash flow. They're saying they're not going to cut people. They're saying $6 billion of synergies, no headcount.
Do you believe that? Do you believe that, Laura? I feel like there's a lot of back and forth about that one.
Yeah. So the answer is they must have hits. They say they're going to go to 30 films, which is a lot of films. And if they have hits through the profits of the hits they make, because that's a lot of films, yes, they will be able to then not cut people. But if some of their films don't hit, or if they spend $100 million on a film and it only makes 20, they have to pay the debt. Because if they don't pay the debt, they bankrupt the entity. So they have to pay the debt first, which says to me, less creativity, less risk taking, more formulaic, more sequels. And the IP, Warner Brothers library is fantastic for IP. So maybe sequels wouldn't be the worst thing, but it will take them about 3 years to return to investment grade, and that is their goal, which I think means less creativity for Hollywood films. But at least we're making films. I think with Netflix, there was a real danger they wouldn't make films as soon as the government didn't force them to make films to get regulatory approval.
And so if they're not able to properly address this debt situation, is this a sinking ship scenario here? I mean, if you think about all of these names in particular, people tend to be a bit more critical about which places and names that they're actually willing to pay subscriptions for. So you talk about the importance here of them actually being able to have some great projects that people are really able to sink their teeth into.
Well, so we have HBO and Discovery Plus, and we have all their assets now combined, and Paramount Plus. So we have 3 services. I would expect to put them to put them into one bundle, sell them separately, but then also bundle them for the discount. So, I don't think there's better programmers in the TV business than HBO. So they will have best-in-class television programming.
So why is this maybe the media deal that works, Laura? You know the history, and I think go back to AOL, Time Warner, I think Cap Cities, Disney. They don't have a great history or track record.
Who? Media companies?
Media mergers.
Right. You're totally right about that. Look, P-Sky was going to go
I love media companies. I love working for media companies. I hope they stick around forever.
So I was just going to say, P-Sky was subscale. It was going to go under, trying to compete with these big, deep-pocketed guys. Now it's going to try to do it with Warner. It may still go under and take Warner with it. But I sort of think they couldn't have worked without Warner. So now they're big enough, with enough scale, with a huge, really high quality library to do a better job of streaming, to do a better job of films. But really high debt, which really gives them, sort of a straitjacket in terms of their decision making, because the debt must be paid first. But if they can get the debt down, even if they don't reaccomplish investment grade, if they can just make enough free cash flow to, and all they need is a couple of hits to get that debt down faster, which will make the equity rise. So, and I do think their vision for the future of Hollywood is really innovative. So we just have to, once we get the regulatory approvals, the risks go down to execution risks. And right now we have both regulatory risks and execution risks, one on top of the other.
Hey, got about 30 seconds left. Remiss not to mention Netflix real quickly. They now have $208 billion to throw in their pocket because of the breakup fee. Are they in good shape, or do they need to do, I know we always talk about them with content as well, just real quickly.
Yeah, great. The Netflix is doing great. They can go back to their knitting. They're doing interesting things, little steps for little feet. They do not believe in the box office. I think that's like a crime, but they're just going to go back to being a global television distributor in your home. Fine.
Yeah, fine. And I'm going to probably continue paying my monthly Netflixes.
Oh, for sure.
Netflix bill. We just do. Yeah. We just do. Laura, always love catching up with you. Be well. Have a great week. Laura Martin there, everybody. She's, of course, at Needham & Company, senior analyst. She covers media, entertainment, and internet, just knows this space like no others. Hey, just quickly want to mention Boeing shares. We're seeing them sell off down as much as 4%. Some airlines said to pause leasing order discussions, considering halting jet deliveries. The Iran war has airlines reviewing growth plans as fuel costs rise. That makes sense, something we're tracking. We're back in a moment.